Mom said it like a prayer. Hope she crashes, she laughed, coffee in hand, as my stepfather's fist tightened around his beer can. That night, he beat me until I went silent. He didn't know the microphone on my car keys had been recording everything for the past 6 months. My name is Madeline Shore. I am 32 years old, and I design the nervous systems for electric cars. At Voltus, the company where I work, they call me the quiet genius. I create elegant, efficient pathways for information, turning raw electricity into controlled, purposeful motion. My life is about logic, about signals and responses, about ensuring that every component communicates flawlessly. My home life, however, was a masterclass in static and corrupted data. The house sat on a quiet street in Fair Lake, Illinois, a place that prided itself on manicured lawns and the illusion of tranquility. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of a game show on TV, the scent of my mother's Chardonnay, and the sour tang of my stepfather's cheap beer. It was a Tuesday night, which meant Rick was 3 beers deep into his usual throne, a worn armchair with springs so broken they groaned whenever he shifted his weight. He was a former mechanic, a man whose hands once understood the clean logic of an engine, but were now just tools for holding a can and clenching into a fist. Unemployment had hollowed him out, leaving behind a bitter resentment that radiated from him in waves. I was leaving. I had made the mistake of stopping by after work for what my mother, Carol, called a family dinner, which was her code for needing me to fix her laptop or listen to her complain about the neighbors. I stood by the door, my car keys a comforting weight in my hand. "Well, I should get going. I have an early start tomorrow," I said, keeping my voice neutral. My mother looked up from her wine glass, a small, polished smile on her face that never quite reached her eyes. It was her public-facing smile, the one she used for church bake sales and PTA meetings years ago, the one that said, "We are a perfect, loving family." She raised her glass in a mock toast. The TV blared a commercial jingle, a grotesquely cheerful soundtrack to the moment. "Drive safe, honey," she said, her voice light and airy. Then she turned to Rick, a conspiratorial glint in her eye, and laughed. It was a small, sharp sound, like glass breaking. "Hope she crashes." She said it like a prayer, a casual, throwaway curse disguised as a joke. Rick grunted in amusement, his eyes fixed on the television, his fist tightening around his sweating beer can. The words didn't just hang in the air. They landed on me, heavy and cold. It wasn't the first time she'd said something like that, something coated in sugar but filled with poison. But it was the first time the world seemed to slow down, the first time I felt the full, crushing weight of it. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Arguing would only make it worse, inviting Rick's simmering rage to boil over. Silence was the armor I had learned to wear in that house. I gave a tight, meaningless nod and walked out, the screen door slamming shut behind me with a pathetic clap. The engine of my Voltus sedan turned over with a near-silent hum, a stark contrast to the noise inside the house. As I pulled out of the driveway, the porch light caught the furious movement of the front door swinging open. Rick stood there, silhouetted, his voice a ragged roar that tore through the quiet suburban night. "Ungrateful bitch." A silver object arced through the air. I flinched as a nearly full can of beer slammed into my passenger side door. The clang was obscene in the stillness, a percussive shock that vibrated through the car's frame. I saw the foam and beer explode against the window, dripping down the pristine metallic paint like a wound. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just pressed the accelerator, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I drove for less than a minute, maybe 2. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. My vision blurred. I pulled over at the first intersection, the red light of the 4-way stop bleeding into my windshield. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely uncurl them from the wheel. The car was silent, but my ears were ringing with his shout, with her laugh. My fingers fumbled for the keychain. It was a sleek, unassuming piece of black plastic, no larger than a thumb drive, a gift to myself 6 months ago. It had a single, tiny, almost invisible button on its side. My thumb found it. Pressing down for 2 seconds, a small, tinny sound emerged from the device's speaker. First, there was static, the sound of my own footsteps on the linoleum floor, the distant, canned laughter from the TV. Then, my mother's voice, artificially high-pitched but unmistakably clear. "Drive safe, honey." A pause, the clink of her wine glass against the table, and then the laugh, that sharp, brittle sound. "Hope she crashes." Rick's grunt of approval, the sound of him shifting in the broken armchair, it was all there, every syllable, every damning nuance. I pressed the button again, and the recording stopped. The silence that followed was immense. I had bought the microphone for safety. An impulse purchase after a late night at the office had left me feeling vulnerable walking through the cavernous parking garage. I'd imagined it as a tool against a stranger, a faceless threat in the dark. I never, not once, imagined the monster it would capture was already inside the house, smiling at me over a glass of wine. For 6 months, it had been clipped to my keys, a silent witness. For 6 months, it had been gathering evidence of a different kind of danger, the slow, creeping rot of the place I once called home. I didn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't. I drove to a nondescript motel on the edge of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and sheets that smelled of industrial bleach. I paid in cash and locked the door, leaning against it until the trembling in my legs subsided. The next few days were a blur of hollow moments. I called in sick to work, something I never did. I lay on the stiff motel bed, the recording of my mother's voice playing on a loop in my head. I didn't eat. I barely slept. In the unforgiving fluorescent light of the motel bathroom, I saw the map of my life laid out before me. The years of tiptoeing around Rick's temper, the years of swallowing my mother's casual cruelties, the years of pretending that their version of love wasn't just a cage. On the third day, a bruise bloomed on my arm, a deep purple and blue shadow where I'd braced myself against the steering wheel when the can hit the car. I stared at it in the mirror. It was an ugly, physical manifestation of the night, but looking at it, I didn't feel fear or sadness. A strange calm settled over me, cold and clear as ice. The shaking had stopped. The panic had receded. In its place, something new was taking root. It was an engineer's clarity. A problem had been identified. The system was critically flawed. All the data points, the thrown beer can, the years of verbal cuts, the financial dependency they exploited, her final, hateful wish, they all led to a single, logical conclusion. A system this broken cannot be fixed. It must be dismantled. I took a shower, the hot water washing away the motel's grime, but not the newfound steel in my spine. I got dressed, not in the comfortable clothes I'd been hiding in, but in the crisp, professional attire I wore to work. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. The bruise was still there, but my eyes were different. The fear was gone. I checked out of the motel. I drove back towards Fair Lake, back towards the house with the broken armchair and the wine-stained smiles. But I wasn't running back to them. I wasn't going back to endure, to survive, to escape. I was going back to collect more data. My plan was no longer to leave them behind. It was to return everything they had ever given me, every bit of pain, every casual cruelty, every moment of fear. I was bringing it all back. This wasn't about escape anymore. It was about a controlled, systematic, and total retaliation. My mother, Carol, had a favorite saying, one she polished and presented at every holiday gathering or awkward neighborhood barbecue. "This family," she would announce, her hand placed theatrically over her heart, "weathers every storm." It was her personal tagline, the slogan for the Shore Lewis brand of domestic bliss. To outsiders, it probably sounded noble, a testament to resilience and unity. But I knew the truth. In our family, Rick was the storm, a Category 5 hurricane of resentment and cheap beer, and my mother wasn't weathering it. She was the one holding the door open for the wind and handing him the matches to light the fires. Their partnership was a masterwork of toxic symbiosis. He provided the chaos. She provided the justification. His rage was just passion. His verbal abuse was just him telling it like it is. His unemployment wasn't a failure. It was a forced early retirement that allowed him to focus on the house. She was the PR department for his one-man reign of terror, spinning his every flaw into a misunderstood virtue. The foundation of their marriage, and of my childhood, was built on this shared delusion that their dysfunction was a form of strength. I tested that foundation once, when I was 19. He had cornered me in the kitchen, his face blotchy and red, screaming about the car insurance bill being $5 higher than the month before. His voice was a physical force, pinning me against the counter. For the first time, I didn't shrink. I stood my ground, told him it wasn't my fault, that he was being irrational. His hand flew up, and while it stopped an inch from my face, the promise of violence was so absolute it felt like a blow. That night, after he'd passed out in his chair, I called the police from my bedroom, my voice a whispered tremor. A patrol car arrived, its lights off, a quiet shadow in the driveway. A tired-looking officer listened patiently on the porch, while my mother, wrapped in a silk robe, performed the role of a lifetime. She was shocked, simply shocked, that I would make such a dramatic call. It was a simple misunderstanding, a family squabble. Rick was just under a lot of stress. When the officer asked to speak to me alone, my mother intercepted, her hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. She pulled me into the living room, her voice a furious hiss. "What are you doing? Madeline, do you have any idea what this will do to us? You will destroy your stepfather's reputation, our reputation. Is that what you want? To tear this family apart over nothing?" Tear it apart, as if it wasn't already a collection of broken pieces held together by her desperate, suffocating glue. I looked from her frantic eyes to the sleeping form of the man she was protecting. I saw the officer, weary and resigned, waiting by the door. I understood then that no one was coming to save me. My mother had already convinced the world and herself that there was nothing to be saved from. I told the officer I had overreacted. He gave me a look, one I now recognize as pity, handed me a card for a domestic abuse hotline, and left. The next day, my mother threw the card in the trash. The incident was never spoken of again, but it became another brick in the wall of my silence. So I built a different life. I moved out, put myself through college with a combination of scholarships and the small trust my biological father had left for my education, a fund my mother couldn't touch. I got the job at Voltus. It was more than a job. It was a sanctuary. In my lab, logic reigned. Problems had solutions. Systems were designed to be efficient, elegant, and above all, predictable. There was no room for irrational rage or emotional manipulation in a circuit board. My colleagues respected my work. They valued my focus. When they called me the quiet genius, it was with admiration, not a dismissal. They saw my silence as a sign of deep thought, not fear. For 8 hours a day, I was the person I was supposed to be: competent, calm, and in control. Then I would get a text from my mother, and the carefully constructed walls of my professional life would feel paper-thin. She never asked about my projects, my successes, or my life. Her communications were a litany of perceived slights. I had forgotten her birthday, never mind that I had sent a $200 floral arrangement that she'd never acknowledged. I didn't call enough. When I did call, I didn't sound cheerful enough. I was selfish, wrapped up in my own world, forgetful of the family that loved me so much. Every conversation was a guilt trap, designed to pull me back into the orbit of their misery. Rick, in his own way, was just as relentless. His messages were a bizarre cocktail of feigned paternal affection and thinly veiled threats. "You're still my daughter, even if you hate me," he'd text, usually late at night after a few beers, or, "Your mother worries about you. You should be more considerate of her feelings." It was always about their feelings, their needs, their comfort. I was not a person to them. I was a resource, a financial and emotional wellspring they could tap whenever they wanted. And they tapped it often. They were living, quite comfortably, off the inheritance my real father had left my mother. He had been a careful man, an accountant who believed in planning for the future. He never would have imagined his hard-earned money would be used to subsidize the life of a lazy, abusive drunk. When the roof needed replacing, I got the call. When the water heater broke, my phone rang. I paid for it. Always. I sent gifts on holidays, on their anniversary, on birthdays. I transferred money when my mother would call with a sob story about an unexpected bill. I did it all in the foolish hope that one day my contributions would be seen, that they would finally see me as the responsible, caring daughter I was trying so hard to be. Instead, every check I wrote, every gift I sent, was simply absorbed into their sense of entitlement. My generosity wasn't appreciated. It was expected. And when I failed to meet some unstated expectation, I was immediately branded the ungrateful child. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could I design complex, self-correcting automotive systems by day and be unable to navigate the primitive, broken logic of my own family by night for years? I told myself it was my duty. I told myself that walking away completely would be cruel. I let their narrative that I was the difficult one, the cold one, seep into my own self-perception. That all changed with a letter. It arrived on a Saturday, a crisp white envelope from a financial institution I didn't recognize, Sterling Bridge Lending. I assumed it was junk mail, another pre-approved credit card offer, but it was addressed to me, specifically, Madeline A. Shore. My curiosity piqued. I tore it open. Inside was a statement for a home equity line of credit. The balance was just over $85,000. The property listed as collateral was the house in Fairlake. My house. My father had left it to me in his will, with a clause that my mother could live there for the rest of her life. The deed, the ownership, was solely in my name. I stared at the paper, my mind struggling to process the information. It was a mistake. It had to be. A clerical error. I had never applied for a loan from Sterling Bridge Lending. I hadn't taken out a second mortgage on my own house. My hands started to shake, the same tremor from the night at the intersection. I sat down at my kitchen table, the letter spread out before me like a death sentence. There, at the bottom of the page, was a digital copy of a signature on the loan application. It was a flawless imitation of my own. Close, but not perfect. A slight hesitation in the loop of the L in Madeline, a flourish on the E in Shore that I never used. It was a forgery. The blood drained from my face. $85,000. Where had it gone? A new pickup truck for Rick sitting in the driveway. The 2-week cruise to the Caribbean my mother had bragged about a few months ago. The new top-of-the-line television mounted on the living room wall. It all clicked into place. A horrifying, sickening calculation. They hadn't just used me. They hadn't just manipulated and abused me. They had stolen from me. They had used my name, my identity, my property, to fund their lifestyle, all while calling me ungrateful. That was the moment the last thread of familial obligation snapped. The quiet genius from Voltus, the one who spent her days finding and eliminating system vulnerabilities, finally turned her analytical gaze inward. They had made a critical error. They had underestimated me. They saw me as a passive, emotional creature they could easily control. They had forgotten that I was an engineer. I understood systems, and I knew, with an absolute and chilling certainty, exactly how to bring this one crashing down. The microphone on my keychain was no longer a defensive measure. It was the first step in a carefully planned demolition. The phone call came 2 weeks after I discovered the fraudulent loan. It was my mother's number, but I had stopped answering her calls, letting them go to voicemail where she would leave rambling, guilt-laden messages that I would delete without listening. This time, however, she was persistent. She called 3 times in a row. On the 4th call, a cold, calculated curiosity made me answer. Her voice was a performance of raw panic, an octave higher than usual. Madeline, thank God. It's Rick. He's had a heart attack. I held the phone to my ear, my own heart rate remaining perfectly steady. I processed the words like a diagnostic report. Input Rick. Heart attack. Probability low. My mother was a terrible liar. But she was a master of exaggeration. A bad case of indigestion could become a near-death experience if it served her narrative. "Is he at the hospital?" I asked, my tone flat, devoid of the alarm she was clearly trying to elicit. There was a brief hesitation on her end. No, he's here. He refused to go. The paramedics came, but he sent them away. He's just resting. But he's so pale. Madeline, I'm so scared. I need you to come over." The lie was obvious. If paramedics had been called for a potential cardiac event and the patient refused transport, there would be a record. They wouldn't have just left without him signing a release form against medical advice. She was setting a trap. But the engineer in me, the part that was now running my life, saw an opportunity, a controlled experiment. I had been planning my next move, my next data-gathering expedition, and they had just handed me a perfect pretext. I was no longer the daughter responding to a crisis. I was the analyst going into the field to observe the subjects in their natural, agitated state. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, and hung up before she could layer on any more fake hysterics. The drive to Fair Lake was different this time. I wasn't filled with dread or anxiety. I felt a strange, cold sense of purpose. My hand rested on the gear shift, steady and calm, my keys, with their silent passenger, lay on the passenger seat. I had been carrying them everywhere, a talisman of my new resolve. Before I left my apartment, I had pressed the tiny button, activating the microphone. The device had a 6-hour battery life, more than enough. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same, deceptively peaceful. Rick's new truck, bought with my stolen equity, gleamed under the afternoon sun. I walked up to the front door and let myself in without knocking. The scene inside was pure stagecraft. Rick was in his usual armchair, a blanket draped over his legs. He wasn't pale. His face was ruddy with anger. My mother was fluttering around him, dabbing a damp cloth on his forehead, as if he were a convalescing king. There was an open bottle of prescription pills on the end table next to him. A quick glance at the label told me they were nothing more than strong antacids. The heart attack was a case of heartburn. They both looked up as I entered. My mother rushed towards me, her face a mask of weary relief. "Oh, Madeline, thank you for coming. He's just been so stubborn." Rick's eyes narrowed into slits. He looked from me to the pills on the table and seemed to understand that his medical drama had been exposed. With a guttural roar, he snatched the plastic pill box and hurled it against the wall. The pills scattered across the floor like tiny white seeds. "I don't need your goddamn pity," he bellowed, his voice thick with rage. "You think you can just waltz in here? Looking down on me, I'm still the man of this house." I didn't flinch. I simply stood there, my gaze moving from his contorted face to my mother's. She stood frozen by the doorway, her hands clasped together, watching the two of us as if we were characters in a television show she found mildly interesting. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched, her expression a perfect blank. In her silence, I saw her consent. She was a spectator to the violence she had orchestrated. I kept my voice low, analytical. "I came because you called. Mom, you said he had a heart attack." "He was in pain," she insisted, her voice defensive. "It's just heartburn, isn't it?" I said, looking directly at Rick. That was the final trigger. His face purpled. For a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me, but he seemed to root himself in his chair, his power coming from his voice alone. The verbal assault that followed was familiar. A torrent of insults I had heard 1,000 times before. I was ungrateful. I was cold. I thought I was better than them with my fancy job and my quiet arrogance. I let the words wash over me. They were just noise now, just data points for a file that was already full. When he finally ran out of breath, I turned my back on him. It was a calculated move, a signal that the conversation, such as it was over. I intended to walk out of that house and never return until I was accompanied by a lawyer. I took one step towards the door. That was my mistake. I had miscalculated his threshold for being ignored. The first blow came from behind, a sledgehammer fist to my right shoulder. The force of it spun me around, a gasp of pain and surprise escaping my lips. My meticulously constructed composure shattered. Before I could regain my balance, his other hand came up, an open palm that connected with the side of my face. The sound was a sharp, wet crack that echoed in the silent room. My head snapped back, and the world tilted violently. The slap was so powerful it sent a shockwave of pins and needles across my skin, and for a second, all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears. Through the ringing, I heard my mother's voice, not a shout of intervention, but a thin, reedy cry. "Rick, stop." But she didn't move towards him. She didn't step between us. She remained a statue by the wall, her command utterly useless, a token gesture to absolve herself of responsibility. I stumbled backwards, disoriented, my vision swimming. My heel caught on the edge of the area rug, and I went down. It was a clumsy, graceless fall, a complete surrender of control. My head struck the sharp corner of the oak coffee table on the way down. The impact was a dull, sickening thud. A flash of white-hot light exploded behind my eyes, followed by an encroaching darkness. I landed on the floor in a heap, the side of my face pressed against the rough fibers of the rug. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the roaring in my ears and the throbbing in my head. Then, sensation returned in a hot, wet rush. I felt a trickle of warmth snaking its way down from my hairline, past my temple, and onto my cheek. Blood. My eyes fluttered open. My focus was blurry, but I could make out the details of the world from my new, lowly perspective. I saw the leg of the coffee table, its dark wood gleaming under the yellow lamplight from the corner of the room. I saw a single, forgotten antacid pill lying next to a dust bunny under the couch. I saw my mother's sensible shoes take a hesitant step forward, then stop. And then I heard her voice again, no longer shouting, but a low, venomous hiss, laced with a chilling disappointment. It was not directed at Rick, it was directed at me, the bleeding, broken thing on her floor. "You shouldn't have come back." The words cut deeper than the corner of the table. They were the final, irrefutable truth of our relationship. My pain was an inconvenience. My presence was a disruption. My very existence was the problem. In that moment, lying on the floor of the house I owned, bleeding from a wound inflicted by her husband, I understood that she had never loved me. She had only loved the idea of me, the daughter she could control, the resource she could exploit. A primal instinct screamed at me to get up, to run, to escape, but the engineer took over. My mind, even through the fog of pain, was a marvel of clarity. This was the moment. This was the most critical data point I would ever collect. I began to crawl, my movements slow and agonizing. My shoulders screamed in protest. My head felt like it was splitting in two. I ignored it. I crawled towards the front door, away from them. I could hear Rick breathing heavily, the adrenaline of his rage starting to fade. I could feel my mother's eyes on my back. My purse had fallen near the doorway when I fell. My keys were inside. As I crawled past it, my hand shot out, my fingers clumsy and slick with a mixture of sweat and blood. My thumb fumbled, searching for the familiar shape of the keychain. I found it. It had been recording this whole time, every word, every sound, the thud of the pillbox against the wall, his screaming, the sickening crack of the slap, the dull impact of my head against the table, her final, damning sentence. My thumb pressed the button, a tiny, affirmative click. A small red light, no bigger than a pinprick, blinked once on the side of the device, confirming the recording was active and ongoing. I kept crawling, dragging myself over the threshold and out onto the porch. The cool evening air was a shock to my fevered skin. I pulled myself up using the railing, my body a symphony of pain. I didn't look back. I stumbled to my car, my mind a blank slate, except for 3 words that played on a loop. A new mantra that replaced all the fear, all the pain, all the years of suffocating hope. Neat, clean data. Every sound had been captured, every second of the assault, every syllable of their monstrous truth. It was perfect. It was pristine. It was the first real weapon I had ever possessed, and I was going to use it to burn their world to the ground. The emergency room doctor was young and efficient. He put 4 stitches above my temple with steady hands, his expression a careful mix of professionalism and sympathy. He asked me how I fell. I told him I tripped, that I was clumsy. He didn't press, but the knowing look in his eyes told me he had heard the same lie 1,000 times before. He gave me a pamphlet on domestic violence, the same kind the police officer had given me years ago. This time, I didn't let my mother throw it away. I tucked it into my purse, a small trophy from my visit to the front lines. My apartment became a sterile recovery room, a laboratory for my revenge. The silence in my small, meticulously organized space was a balm against the memory of the chaos. But I didn't try to forget. Forgetting was a liability. Instead, I established a ritual every morning. Before I began my remote workday, I would sit at my desk with a cup of black coffee, open my laptop, and navigate to a password-protected folder on a secure, encrypted drive. The folder was named simply Evidence for Me. Inside was a growing collection of audio files, each one meticulously labeled with the date and time of its creation. I would choose one at random and listen to exactly 1 minute of it, no more, no less. It wasn't an act of self-torture, it was a calibration, a daily reminder of the mission. I would listen with the detached focus of an engineer analyzing a system failure. The files were a symphony of their dysfunction. There was the high-fidelity recording of the assault, which I labeled the first hit. The sound was terrifyingly clear, the sharp crack of the slap, the dull thud of my head against the table. My mother's hissed, "You shouldn't have come back." But there were other, more insidious sounds on the dozens of other recordings I had accumulated over the months. There were the sounds of my mother's brittle laughter as Rick made a cruel joke at a neighbor's expense, the sound of a plate shattering against a wall, followed by a string of curses, the heavy, wheezing sound of Rick's breathing as he fell asleep in front of the TV, the audio track of his life a constant, low hum of static and rage. These small moments were just as important as the big ones. They were the ambient data that proved the system was corrupt at its core. I knew the assault recording was explosive, but I also knew it wasn't enough. A physical assault case would devolve into a messy, emotional spectacle. My mother would lie for him. She would paint me as an unstable, provocative daughter. They would twist the narrative, and it would be my word against theirs. It would be a blunt instrument, and I needed a scalpel. The financial fraud was my scalpel. It was clean, impersonal, and provably criminal. There is no nuance in a forged signature. There is no emotional defense for grand larceny. My strategy, therefore, was to let them incriminate themselves further. I needed them to talk, to be comfortable, to believe they were getting away with it. I had to let the system run its course long enough for all its fatal flaws to be documented. So I waited. I didn't go to the police. I didn't confront them. I simply disappeared for a few weeks, letting their imaginations run wild. The inevitable call came on a Sunday afternoon. It was my mother, her voice oozing a thick, cloying remorse. "Madeline, honey, we've been so worried. I know things got out of hand. Rick feels just terrible about what happened. He's not himself lately. We want to make it right. Please, can you come over for dinner this week? A real reconciliation dinner. We miss you." It was another piece of theater, but I was no longer in the audience. I was the director now. "I don't know, Mom," I said, pitching my voice to sound hesitant, wounded. "Please," she begged. "It would mean the world to us. Let us apologize properly." "Okay," I said after a long pause, as if I were reluctantly giving in. Friday. The next 3 days were spent preparing. I wasn't planning a menu. I was sourcing surveillance equipment, online. I found what I was looking for, miniature, high-definition cameras with wide-angle lenses and audio capability, perfectly disguised as standard electrical outlet covers. They were powered by the home's own wiring, making them undetectable and long-lasting. I ordered 2. On Friday, I arrived at the house an hour early, carrying a store-bought cheesecake as a peace offering. My excuse was that I had to drop it off before meeting a friend for coffee nearby. As I expected, my mother was flustered by my early arrival, busy in the kitchen. "Oh, you're here already. Just put that in the fridge. Honey, Rick's out back, messing with the sprinklers." It was the opening I needed. "No problem," I said, smiling. "I'll just use the restroom." With my heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm, I walked into the living room. My purse contained the 2 camera outlets and a small screwdriver. The first target was the outlet behind the television. It took less than 90 seconds. Unscrew the old plate, disconnect the 2 wires, connect them to the new camera plate, screw it back in. The tiny pinhole lens was invisible unless you were inches away, searching for it. The second one went in the kitchen, an outlet on the backsplash that had a perfect view of the entire room. I was back in the hallway in under 5 minutes, my hands steady, my breathing even. The system was now online. When I returned that evening, the performance was in full swing. Rick was sober, wearing a clean shirt, and managed a mumbled, "Sorry about, you know." My mother had cooked my favorite meal from childhood, a pathetic attempt to evoke a nostalgia that no longer existed. We ate in a strained silence, the air thick with unspoken words. It was over dessert, the cheesecake I had provided, that Rick's arrogance finally broke through his flimsy facade of remorse. He leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "You know," he said, gesturing around the dining room with his fork, "it's funny when you think about it. This whole house is in your name. We're just living in your house." He chuckled. "Pretty good deal for us, huh?" My mother shot him a warning look, but chimed in smoothly, trying to reframe his idiotic boast. "Well, it just made things simpler with the bank, honey. For the paperwork, it makes the money transfers easier." There it was, a casual, verbal confession, delivered over cheesecake, now being recorded in high-definition video and audio. I felt a cold, exhilarating thrill. I took a slow, deliberate bite, letting the sweetness coat my tongue before I answered. I looked up and gave them a small, serene smile. "That's fine," I said, my voice light. "It's good to be practical about these things, as long as everything has a proper paper trail." They both relaxed, missing the veiled threat completely. They heard paper trail and thought of their neat, forged documents. They thought they were clever. They saw me as their quiet, compliant daughter, the family ATM, the emotional punching bag. They saw me as a systems engineer for an electric car company. And that was true. I had spent years at Voltus designing the intricate communication networks that allowed a vehicle's various components to speak to each other. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that my performance and dedication to system integrity had earned me a promotion 2 years ago. I had been transferred out of vehicle design and into a much more sensitive department. They didn't know that I now worked for Voltus's internal audit and corporate security division. My specialty wasn't cars anymore. It was investigating and dismantling complex fraud schemes. My job, the one they never bothered to ask about, was to trace digital and financial footprints, to identify system vulnerabilities, and to hunt down people who thought they were smart enough to get away with identity theft. They had no idea that for the last 2 years, I had been professionally trained by one of the best corporate forensics teams in the country to do the exact thing I was now doing to them. They were my pet project, my final exam, and they had just failed, spectacularly. The 6 months of passive observation were over. The data had been collected, collated, and cross-referenced. The system's vulnerabilities had been fully mapped. Now it was time to execute the code that would trigger a total system collapse. My hands, once prone to trembling, were now extensions of a cold, precise will. The shift from prey to predator was complete, and it felt like coming home. I didn't begin by going to the police in Fairlake. That would have been amateurish. Inviting the local Small-town dynamics my mother was so adept at manipulating. My approach was corporate, clinical, and digital. I started by filing a formal identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission, creating an official time-stamped record of the crime. The process was automated, impersonal, and beautiful in its efficiency. It asked for facts, not feelings. Name of victim, Madeline A., Shore. Date of discovery. Name of fraudulent institution, Sterling Bridge Lending. Amount stolen, $85,000. $421.16. With the official FTC report number, I then filed a police report online with the state police, not the local department. I was a resident of a different county. After all, I was simply reporting a crime that had been committed against me. I described the unauthorized home equity line of credit, attached a PDF of the fraudulent statement, and my official FTC affidavit. In the section for potential suspects, I wrote, "Unknown. The perpetrators had access to my personal information, including my social security number and a sample of my signature." I did not mention Rick or Carol. They were not my family anymore. They were simply unknown perpetrators. Anonymity was a shield for me and a blindfold for them. It made the investigation about the crime, not the relationship. The final and most critical step was the package I assembled for the fraud department at Sterling Bridge Lending. This was where my professional expertise became my most lethal weapon. I composed a formal, anonymous tip email. The subject line was Urgent Suspected Loan Fraud, Account 77429B, Mashore. In the body of the email, I laid out the facts with the sterile precision of a corporate audit report. I attached the FTC report and the police report number, and then I attached the payload. It was a 62-second audio file, clipped from the hours of recordings I possessed. I had spent a full day cleaning the audio, removing background noise, and isolating their voices until they were crystal clear. The clip began with Rick's smug chuckle. "It's funny when you think about it. This whole house is in your name." It ended with my mother's smooth, complicit explanation. "Well, it just made things simpler with the bank, honey. For the paperwork, it makes the money transfers easier." I embedded the audio file, added a single line. "This conversation was recorded at the property in question," and hit send. I sent it from a newly created, encrypted email address, an untraceable digital ghost. Then, I sat back and let the system I had set in motion do its work. I had lit the fuse. Now all I had to do was wait for the explosion. It took less than 72 hours. The fraud department of a lending institution is not a sentimental place. They are not interested in family drama. They are interested in risk, liability, and asset recovery. An anonymous tip containing a police report number and a clear audio confession of fraud is not something they ignore. It is a 4-alarm fire. My own analysis of the signature, using software and techniques I'd learned at Voltus, confirmed what I already knew: the pressure points, the ink distribution, the slight tremor in the upstroke. It was a decent forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. The bank's professional forensic accountants would see the same thing. They would see a clear-cut case of criminal fraud, and they would act swiftly to mitigate their losses. A week after I sent the email, the first domino fell. I imagined the scene with a cold, cinematic clarity. Rick, at the grocery store, his cart filled with beer and frozen pizzas. He pushes it to the checkout, slides his debit card, the one linked to the account where he'd likely funneled the loan money. The cashier runs it. A pause. She runs it again. "I'm sorry, sir. It's declined." The flush of red on his face, the sputtering indignation. "Try it again. There's money in there." The cashier's polite, firm refusal, the line of people behind him, watching, the public, mundane humiliation. That was the first tremor. The earthquake hit a few hours later. My phone rang, and the screen displayed my mother's name. I let it ring twice, then answered, my voice a calm, neutral. "Hello?" Her voice was a frantic squawk, stripped of all its practiced poise. Madeline, the bank. They froze Rick's account. They froze everything. They said, there's an investigation." I feigned a mild, detached surprise. "Oh, What kind of investigation? I don't know. Something about the loan. They asked about the house, about the signatures. They said they received a tip. The panic was making her sloppy. She was admitting everything. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air, a vast, empty space for her to project all of her fears. Then, I delivered the line I had been rehearsing for days, my voice infused with a perfect, calculated innocence. Is that so? That's bizarre, I said, a thoughtful frown in my tone. What a strange coincidence. Whose signature looks so much like mine? I wonder. The other end of the line went completely dead. Not a disconnect, just pure, absolute silence. I could hear the faint hum of the connection, but she wasn't breathing, wasn't speaking, wasn't making a sound. In that crushing silence, I felt the entire history of our relationship invert. For 32 years, she had held all the power, her moods and manipulations dictating the terms of my existence. Now, I held it all. She knew that I knew, and she knew that I was the one who had pulled the pin from the grenade. After what felt like an eternity, she ended the call without another word. The screen went dark. I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no pity, no anger. It was simply a successful test of a hypothesis. Action A produces a predictable reaction, B. The system was performing exactly as designed. That evening, as I was working on a project for Voltus, a new email popped into my inbox. It wasn't from my mother. It wasn't from Rick. It was from a senior investigator in the Financial Crimes Unit of the state's Attorney General Office, CC'd to the head of security at Sterling Bridge Lending. The subject line was Case File 881 A People vs. Richard Lewis. The email was brief and formal. It stated that based on evidence provided by the lender, including forensic analysis of loan documents and a credible tip from a confidential informant, their office was officially pressing charges against Richard Lewis for aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. They also noted that Carol Lewis was being investigated as a possible accessory. They were requesting a formal deposition from the victim, Madeline Shore, at my earliest convenience. I read the words pressing charges 3 times. I looked down at my hands, resting on the keyboard. There wasn't the slightest tremor. The fear, the anxiety, the years of conditioned helplessness, it had all been cauterized, burned away by the clean, bright fire of my own calculated actions. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the confidential informant. I was the primary witness. I was the architect of their downfall. I opened my laptop to draft a reply to the investigator, and a small, cold smile touched my lips. I was winning. The room they put us in wasn't an interrogation room. Not officially. It was a family conference room, a beige, windowless box designed with the flimsy pretense of being a soft place for hard conversations. It had a cheap laminate table, 4 uncomfortable chairs, and the faint, institutional smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. The only decoration was a faded motivational poster about teamwork. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I was the last to arrive. An officer with a tired face led me down a hallway of scuffed linoleum tiles under the hum of fluorescent lights. He opened the door, and for a moment, I was a spectator at the premiere of a play I had written and produced. They were already seated, Rick and my mother, side by side, facing a man in a rumpled suit who I correctly assumed was the lead investigator. They looked small in that room, diminished. Rick was slumped in his chair, his usual blustering bravado replaced by a gray, pasty pallor. The anger was still in his eyes, but it was a sullen, impotent anger, the kind you see in a caged animal that knows the fight is over. My mother looked like she had aged a decade in a week. Her makeup was a little too thick, a desperate attempt to paint over the dark circles of sleepless nights. She was trying for an expression of wrong dignity, but the trembling of her hands, which she had clasped together on the table, betrayed her terror. They both looked up as I entered. Rick's eyes were full of pure, undiluted hatred. My mother's held a flicker of something else, a desperate, pathetic plea for an alliance, for me to remember that we were in her words. Family. I ignored them both. My focus was on the investigator, who rose as I entered. Ms. Shore, he said, extending a hand. I'm Detective Miller. Thank you for coming in. His handshake was firm, his eyes weary but sharp. He had the look of a man who had seen every possible permutation of human ugliness and was rarely surprised anymore. Of course, I said, my voice even. I took the empty seat directly across from my mother, placing my purse on the floor beside me. The geometry of the room was now perfect, them on one side, me and the law on the other. Detective Miller sat back down and opened a thin folder, though he barely glanced at it. So, he began, his voice a low, calm baritone that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. The financial case is, to be blunt, straightforward. We have the bank's forensic report on the signature. We have the account records showing the transfer and subsequent spending of the funds. The district attorney is very confident about the fraud and identity theft charges against Mr. Lewis. He nodded slightly towards Rick, who flinched as if he'd been struck. And we are strongly considering charges of accessory and conspiracy for you, Mrs. Lewis. My mother made a small, strangled sound, a mouse caught in a trap. However, Miller continued, his gaze shifting to me, that's not the only reason we're all here. In cases like this, involving family members, the question of coercion often comes up. A forged signature is one thing, a signature obtained under duress, or as part of a larger pattern of intimidation and abuse, is another. It elevates the severity of the entire situation. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Ms. Shore, I need to ask, has Mr. Lewis, or Mrs. Lewis, ever threatened you? Have they ever been physically violent with you? This was it. The moment the two streams of their criminality, the financial and the physical, were about to merge into a single, unstoppable river. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother begin to shake her head frantically, her mouth opening to spin a new lie. Rick just glared, his jaw muscles working. I didn't answer the detective directly. Instead, I calmly reached down and picked up my purse. Placing it on the table, I unzipped the main compartment and took out my car keys. They made a soft, metallic jingle in the silent room. I detached the small, black plastic rectangle from the keyring and placed it in the center of the table. It looked like nothing, a cheap piece of electronics. Harmless. What is that? Miller asked, his curiosity piqued. It's a recording device, I said simply. I've been carrying it for my own safety for the past 6 months. My mother's face went white. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving behind the garish mask of her foundation. Rick's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally breaking through the rage. You have a recording. Miller leaned forward, his professional weariness gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. A recording of what, exactly? I have recordings of many things, I said, my gaze locking onto my mother's. But I think this one will answer your question about the family dynamic. My thumb pressed the small button on the side. For a second, there was only a faint hiss of static. Then, a sound filled the dead air of the beige room. A sound so clear and vivid it felt like we were all back in my mother's living room. First, my mother's voice, light and airy. Drive safe, honey. Then the brittle, sharp laugh. And the prayer. The curse. Hope she crashes. Rick's approving grunt followed, low and guttural. Then, the sound of his armchair groaning as he shifted his weight. The recording ended. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void was deafening. No one moved. No one breathed. The four of us sat frozen around the table, the echo of my mother's voice hanging between us like a toxic cloud. Detective Miller stared at the small black device, then looked at my mother, his expression unreadable but utterly damning. It was my mother who broke the silence, her voice a desperate, cracking whisper. She forced a smile, a grotesque twitch of her lips. We were just joking. Madeline, you know how we are. It was just a dark joke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I kept my gaze fixed on her, my own voice quiet, but carrying the sharp, cutting edge of a razor. A joke that I still hear in my sleep. Her smile collapsed, her face crumpled, the carefully constructed facade of the loving mother dissolving into the raw terror of a woman who had just heard the doors of a prison cell slam shut. From beside her, Rick finally spoke, his voice a low, venomous rumble. You little traitorous snake." "That's enough," Detective Miller said, his voice sharp and authoritative. He held up a hand, silencing Rick instantly. He looked from Rick's hateful face to my mother's crumbling one, and then back to me, and the small, black key on the table. A silent, grim understanding passed between us. He had his context. I glanced at the watch on my wrist. The second hand was sweeping smoothly, methodically. 6 months? 6 months of my life, distilled into a collection of digital files, 214 recordings, every argument, every threat, every drunken slur, every lie, every single one of them as clear and undeniable as the sun in the sky. And I was just getting started. In a town like Fair Lake, secrets don't stay secret for long. They just ferment. The first sign that the seal had broken was a short, dry article on the website of the Fair Lake County Chronicle. It was buried in the local news section, between a story about a zoning dispute and a photo of a prize-winning pumpkin. The headline was clinical. Local man investigated in connection with bank fraud. The article was only 3 paragraphs long. It named Richard Lewis, a former auto mechanic, as the subject of an ongoing investigation by the state's Attorney General's office regarding aggravated identity theft. It mentioned that no charges had been formally filed against his wife, Carol Lewis, but that she was considered a person of interest. It was a small stone, but it landed in the placid pond of Fair Lake, and the ripples spread instantly. The first wave hit the local community Facebook group, Fair Lake Neighbors Connect. The post was a screenshot of the article with the caption, "Anyone know anything about this, the Lewises on Elm Street?" The comments section became a real-time autopsy of my family's reputation. At first, there was disbelief. There must be some mistake. Carol Lewis manages the charity fund at the church. She's the kindest woman, then came the gossip. Tentative at first, then gaining a vicious momentum. I always thought there was something off about him. He lost his job at the garage a few years back, didn't he? I heard he was drinking. They took that big cruise last year. Always wondered how they afforded it. The perfect Fair Lake family, the brand my mother had spent 3 decades curating with her bake sale smiles and perfectly manicured lawn, was publicly dismantled in less than 24 hours. Every holiday card they'd ever sent, every cheerful wave from the porch, was now re-examined through a lens of suspicion. Their life wasn't a testament to suburban virtue anymore. It was a lie. The institutional consequences were swift and brutal. My mother's position as the administrator of the St. Jude's Community Church Charity Fund was built on an impeccable image of trustworthiness, an association with bank fraud. Even as a person of interest, was untenable. She wasn't fired. That would have been too messy. Instead, she was asked to take a leave of absence, pending the outcome of the investigation. The request was delivered by the church pastor and 2 senior board members in a quiet, solemn meeting that, I imagined, was filled with expressions of deep regret and unyielding resolve. She was suspended, publicly and shamefully, from the one role that gave her power and identity in the community. She was no longer Carol Lewis, the pious pillar of the community. She was just Rick Lewis's wife. In the midst of this digital and social implosion, I received an email. It was from a producer for a podcast I'd started listening to during my 6 months of evidence gathering. It was called Daughters Who Survived, a popular true crime podcast that focused not on the perpetrators, but on the quiet, often unseen, strength of the women who endured and escaped familial abuse. The producer said they'd received an anonymous tip from a source I suspected was within the state investigator's office about a particularly compelling case involving financial abuse and psychological coercion. They wanted to know if I would be willing to tell my story. Anonymously, of course. They would disguise my voice. They would change all the names and locations. I would be known only as Jane. I agreed without hesitation. It was the next logical step. The police had the facts. The bank had the evidence. Now, the world would have the narrative, my narrative. The interview was conducted over a secure video call. The host had a gentle, empathetic voice, but her questions were sharp and insightful. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I told my story with the same calm, factual precision I had used in my police report. I spoke of the years of walking on eggshells, of the financial exploitation, of the constant, low-level emotional manipulation. And then, she asked me what the final straw was. I took a breath. There were many final straws, I said, my disguised voice sounding strange and robotic in my own ears. But there was one moment, one sentence, that burned everything else away. I was leaving the house one night, and my mother said something to my stepfather. She thought I couldn't hear. She was smiling when she said it. "What did she say?" the host asked softly. "She said, 'Hope she crashes.'" The host was silent for a long moment. I could hear her take a sharp, involuntary breath. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "She wished you would get into a car accident." "Yes," I said. It was like a prayer, a casual, smiling prayer for my death. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't her daughter. I was just a problem she wished would disappear. The episode, titled Jane's Prayer, was released a week later. I didn't share it. I didn't have to. It exploded. The story of a mother who smiled while wishing her daughter dead was viscerally horrifying. It was a story that transcended the specifics of my case and tapped into a primal fear. Thousands of people listened. They shared it. They commented on social media. My God, Jane is so strong. This is the most chilling thing I've ever heard. I wept for her. I didn't use my name. I didn't use their names. But in Fair Lake, everyone knew. The details were too specific. A former mechanic's stepfather, a daughter who worked in a high-tech industry, a pious mother deeply involved in her church. It didn't matter that the names and town were changed. The truth had its own signature. The story wasn't just about Jane anymore. It was the story of Carol and Rick Lewis, told to the entire world by the daughter they had tried to erase. That night, my phone lit up with a text message. It was from my mother. It was the first time she had contacted me since the disastrous meeting at the police station. The message consisted of 5 simple words, a final, desperate accusation. "You just killed us." I looked at the message, at the words glowing on the screen. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just a profound, empty clarity. They had built their world on a foundation of lies, and I had simply introduced a single, undeniable truth. The resulting collapse was not my doing. It was a matter of physics. I typed my reply, my thumb steady. It was even shorter than hers. "No, I just turned on the mic." The call came late, well after midnight. The city outside my apartment window had finally fallen into a hushed stillness, the usual hum of traffic muted to a distant whisper. I was sitting in the dark, the only light coming from the cool blue glow of my laptop screen, where I was methodically archiving the last of the video files from the hidden cameras. The work was almost done. The system I had built was ready for its final shutdown. When my phone vibrated on the table, the screen lit up the room with a sudden, intrusive glare. The name displayed was Carol. I had changed it from Mom weeks ago. It was a small, necessary act of semantic distancing. I stared at the name, feeling a profound lack of the familiar, gut-wrenching anxiety that a call from her used to induce. There was no dread. There was only a quiet, clinical curiosity. This was the epilogue. This was the final data point. I let it ring 3 times before answering, then held the phone to my ear without speaking. The sound that came through the speaker was one I had never heard before. It was the sound of my mother completely undone. All the layers of performance, the righteous indignation, the martyred sighs, the saccharine sweetness had been burned away. All that was left was the raw, ragged sound of weeping. It was a desperate, ugly sound, punctuated by choked, gasping breaths. "Madeline," she finally managed to say, her voice a shredded ruin. "They were here. The police. They came to the door with a warrant for Rick. They're going to arrest him." A fresh wave of sobs overtook her. They said his bail is set at $100,000. We don't have that. We don't have anything. It's all gone." I remained silent. Through the phone, I could hear her pacing, the sound of her bare feet on the hardwood floors of the house I owned. As she spoke, another sound entered my awareness, faint and far away. It was a siren, slicing through the quiet night. It grew steadily louder, a lonely rising wail traveling through the empty city streets. It was an ambulance or a police car, racing towards some unknown crisis, some other family's worst moment. I found myself focusing on it, tracking its progress as it moved from west to east, a disembodied sound of emergency that had nothing to do with me. "And me," she choked out, her voice rising in panic. "They said I'm next, that they're deciding whether to charge me. What's going to happen to me? Madeline, what am I going to do?" The siren passed its peak and began to fade, its urgency receding into the distance, leaving silence in its wake. The question hung in the air between us, a question she had never truly asked before, for her. I had never been a person to ask for help, only a person to take from. Now, in her utter ruin, she was finally asking, and I had no answer for her. "I know I was wrong," she whispered, her voice dropping, taking on a desperate, pleading tone. "Okay, I know. I made mistakes. I should have stopped him. But he's my husband. And you're my daughter. You're my flesh and blood. Madeline, doesn't that mean anything?" Flesh and blood, the final pathetic appeal to a biological contract she had violated 1,000 times over. It was the last card in her deck, the one she believed was a trump, capable of overriding any sin. I thought of the bruise on my arm, the cut on my head. I thought of the stolen money, of the years of walking on eggshells. I thought of her smiling face in the lamplight, wishing me dead. "I used to believe that, too," I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of anger or accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, a historical record of a belief I no longer held. It was the sound of a door closing, quietly but forever. A long, shuddering silence followed. I could hear her trying to process my words, trying to find a new angle, a new lever to pull. The sound of her ragged breathing filled the space between us. The powerful, all-knowing mother was gone, replaced by a terrified woman who had just realized there were no more moves to make. "What do you want?" she finally asked, her voice small, defeated. "What is it that you want from me?" "Money." "There is no money. An apology. I'm sorry." "Okay, I'm sorry. Just tell me what you want, and I'll do it. Anything." She was trying to bargain, to turn this into a transaction, the only kind of interaction she truly understood. She thought I wanted revenge in a currency she could recognize: humiliation, submission, a pound of flesh. But I had moved beyond that. My goal was not to make her suffer. My goal was to make her see. "I only want one thing," I said, my voice still unnervingly calm. "I want you to hear your own voice, just once." My voice," she stammered, confused. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer. While she was speaking, I had turned to my laptop, my fingers moving surely over the trackpad. I opened the secure folder. I navigated past the video files, past the recordings of the assault, to the very first audio file I had ever saved, the one that had started it all. The file name was Simple Day Zero MP3. I opened my messaging app, found the conversation thread with Carol, and attached the file. The progress bar filled in a fraction of a second. I pressed send. Through the phone, I heard the soft ding of her phone receiving the message. "What was that?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "What did you just send me?" "Open it," I said. It was not a request. It was a command. There was a long pause. I could hear the fumbling sounds of her picking up her phone. The tap of her finger on the screen. Then, silence. A deep, absolute silence that stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. And then I heard it, tinny and distant, filtered through 2 separate phone speakers. I heard her voice, my mother's voice, light, airy, laughing. Hope she crashes. The sound cut off abruptly, as if she had dropped the phone. The silence that followed was different. It was heavier, thicker. It was the sound of a soul being confronted with its own reflection in a shattered mirror. The silence was broken by a single, sharp, indrawn breath. It was a gasp, not of fear, but of horrified recognition. It was the sound of a person hearing their own monstrosity for the very first time. It was followed by a choked, gagging sound, as if the words she had spoken so easily 6 months ago had traveled back in time to physically strangle her. I waited. I listened to the sound of her ragged, choked breathing. There were no more tears, no more words. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been delivered, and it had done its work. After a full minute of this awful, broken sound, the line went dead. She had ended the call. I lowered the phone from my ear and placed it back on the table. The blue glow of my laptop screen seemed softer now. I looked at the contact name, Carol, and her final desperate text message from the night before. I held my finger over the screen, and with a simple, final gesture, I deleted the entire conversation thread, and then the contact itself. The call would not be repeated. There would be no more messages. The last connection had been severed. The war was over. I had won. But as I sat there, in the profound and total silence of my apartment, I felt no elation. I felt no triumph. I felt only a vast, quiet, and desolate peace. The peace of a battlefield after the fighting is done, littered with the wreckage of what used to be a life. I had survived. But survival had a cost, and I knew, in that quiet moment, that I would be paying it for a long time to come. The day of the trial. I dressed in a uniform of deliberate neutrality, a plain white button-down shirt, crisp and sterile, a pair of perfectly tailored gray trousers. My shoes were flat, practical, and made no sound on the polished floors of the courthouse. I wore no makeup, no jewelry, save for the simple watch on my wrist. My hair was pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail. I was not there to be a daughter, a victim, or a person. I was there to be a witness. I was a component of the state's legal machine, a human hard drive ready to present its data. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, and yet somehow more intimidating. It was a world of straight lines and hard surfaces, dark wood paneling, worn smooth by a century of human misery, covered the walls. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a flat, unforgiving glare on everything, stripping the room of all shadow and warmth. The air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of old paper, floor polish, and a faint, underlying current of human anxiety. I was seated in the front row, behind the prosecuting attorney's table. I did not have to wait long. They were brought in through a side door, and the quiet murmur of the courtroom gallery died instantly. Rick came first, flanked by 2 bailiffs. He was wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, the vibrant color a shocking slash against the muted tones of the room. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and the metallic click of the chains was the only sound as he was guided to the defendant's table. He had lost weight. His face was sallow, his eyes darting around the room with a wild, cornered look. When his gaze finally landed on me, it was a physical blow of pure, undiluted venom. I met it without expression, my own face a placid, unreadable mask. My mother followed a moment later. She was not in cuffs, but she might as well have been. She was dressed in a conservative navy blue suit, a desperate attempt to project an image of respectability that had long since evaporated. Her face was a ruin. She walked with her head down, her focus fixed on her own feet, as if she could not bear to look at the faces of the jurors, the judge, or the daughter who had brought her to this place. She sat beside her husband, a small, hunched figure, and kept her eyes resolutely turned away from me. She did not look at me once. The proceedings began with a dry procedural rhythm, the clerk's calls, the judge's formal instructions, the prosecuting attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Davies, laid out the state's case with methodical precision. She began with the financial crimes, presenting the bank's forensic reports, the forged loan documents, the testimony of the fraud investigator. It was a mountain of irrefutable, impersonal evidence. Through it all, I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, my posture straight. I was a statue of composure. Finally, Ms. Davies turned her attention to the second phase of her case. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and resonant, "the state will now present evidence to establish a pattern of coercion, intimidation, and physical violence that contextualizes the financial crimes and demonstrates the defendant's character." She called me to the stand. I walked to the witness box, my steps measured and even. I swore the oath, my voice steady. Ms. Davies led me through the basic facts: my name, my relationship to the defendants, the events of the day I was physically assaulted. I recounted the story with the same dispassionate clarity I had used in my initial report. I described the fake heart attack, the argument, the thrown pillbox. I described the slap, the fall, my head hitting the table. The defense attorney, a weary public defender who looked like he'd already lost, tried to object. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is on trial for financial fraud, not assault." "Overruled," the judge said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "The state has been cleared to establish context. Proceed, Ms. Davies." "Ms. Shore," Davies continued, "you've described the events of that day, but was this an isolated incident? Was there a history of verbal abuse or threatening behavior in the home?" "Yes," I said. "Can you provide the court with a specific example of this behavior?" I looked from Ms. Davies to the judge, then to the jury. I did not look at the defense table. "I can," I said. "I have an audio recording." A quiet ripple went through the courtroom. Ms. Davies nodded to a technician, who was prepared. "Your Honor, the state would like to enter into evidence People's Exhibit 42B, an audio file recovered from a personal recording device belonging to the witness." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The technician hit a key, and a sound system, installed for just these moments, crackled to life. The first sound was the hiss of static, an empty, expectant sound that made the room feel even quieter. Then, my mother's voice, preternaturally cheerful and sharp, filled the space. "Drive safe, honey." It was followed by her laugh, a sound that was no longer just brittle, but monstrous in the solemnity of the courtroom. And then the words that had become the axis upon which my life had turned. "Hope she crashes." Rick's grunt of approval was the final, damning punctuation. The audio cut out, plunging the room back into a silence that was now thick with shock and disgust. I saw a woman on the jury, her hand flying to her mouth. Another juror simply closed her eyes. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Her head slightly raised, her expression frozen. The sound had landed in the sterile room and bloomed into something ugly and undeniable. It was the sound of pure malice, stripped of all pretense. My mother finally looked up. Her eyes met mine across the room, and in them, I saw the last flicker of her self-delusion die. There was no more justification, no more denial. There was only the raw, gaping wound of her own exposed ugliness. It was Rick who broke the spell. He surged to his feet, the chains on his wrists rattling, his face a mask of purple fury. "She set me up," he screamed, his voice cracking. "It was a trap. The whole thing. She was recording everything, that snake. She set us up." The bailiffs moved towards him, their hands on his shoulders, forcing him back into his seat. The judge banged his gavel once, a sharp, authoritative crack. "Order the defendant will be silent." "Ms." Davies turned to me. Her face was calm, but her eyes were alight. "Ms. Shore?" she asked, her voice carrying easily through the stunned courtroom. Did you set them up? I didn't hesitate. I looked past her, towards the defendant's table, though not directly at them. I spoke quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, yet every person in the room heard me. No, I said. I just turned on a microphone. The simplicity of the statement was more devastating than any shouted accusation. It was the truth, unadorned and absolute. I hadn't created their wickedness. I had merely captured it. I was not the author of their downfall. I was simply the archivist. The rest of the trial was a formality. The defense attorney offered a pathetic, half-hearted closing argument. Ms. Davies was concise and brutal. The jury was out for less than an hour. When they returned, I was standing in the back of the courtroom. The verdict was guilty, on all counts. The judge, his face grim, read a short statement before sentencing. This court has been presented with overwhelming evidence of a calculated and cruel series of crimes, he said, his gaze sweeping over Rick and my mother. Crimes not just of financial fraud, but of profound emotional and physical abuse. The evidence, particularly the audio recordings, paints a picture of a household devoid of the love and trust a family is meant to provide. He sentenced Rick to the maximum allowed by law. He sentenced my mother to a lesser, but still substantial, term as an accessory. I didn't watch as they were led away. I didn't need to. My work in that room was done. I turned my back on the defense table for the final time and walked towards the heavy doors at the rear of the courtroom. As I pushed the door open, a shaft of brilliant, almost blinding, afternoon sunlight streamed in, momentarily washing out the grim artificial light of the courtroom. I stepped out onto the top step of the courthouse, into the clean, cool air. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the brightness. I was holding my car keys in my hand. I had been clutching them for the entire proceeding. As I stood there, a single ray of sun caught the polished silver of the house key on the ring. It glinted, a tiny, sharp star of light in the palm of my hand. The key that had recorded their darkness was now reflecting the light. I closed my fingers around it, the metal cool and solid against my skin, and walked down the steps, away from the courthouse, into the rest of my life. I drove home from the courthouse on autopilot. The traffic lights changed from red to green. Other cars merged and turned. The city moved around me in its usual, oblivious rhythm. The world had not stopped. The sun was still bright. The sky was a placid, cloudless blue. It felt strange, like walking out of a dark, intense movie theater into a matinee afternoon. The reality I had been living in a cramped, suffocating world of strategy, secrets, and sound files had just ended, and the world outside had not even noticed. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. The emotions I had expected to feel relief, vindication, even a grim satisfaction were all absent. In their place was a profound and unnerving stillness. It was the quiet of a system that has finally been powered down. The frantic, whirring processes of anger and fear and calculation had ceased, leaving behind a clean, silent void. The problem was solved. The program had run its course. When I pulled into my designated spot in the apartment building's garage, I turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. I sat in the humming silence of the electric car. The silence I had helped design. I looked at the concrete wall in front of me. For months, this car, this driver's seat, had been my command center, my war room. It was where I had listened to the first recording, where I had made the decision to fight back, where I had driven to and from their house on my missions of espionage. Now, it was just a car again. I reached for my purse on the passenger seat. My fingers found the keys, and as I pulled them out, the soft, familiar jingle of the metal sounded different in the quiet garage. It was no longer the sound of my weapon. It was just the sound of my keys. I got out, the car door closing with a solid, final thud. Upstairs, in the sterile quiet of my apartment, I didn't take off my coat. I walked directly to my desk, sat down, and woke my laptop from its sleep. The screen glowed to life, showing the neat, orderly grid of files and folders that constituted my life. I navigated to the secure, encrypted drive, entered the 16-character password, and opened the folder Evidence for Me. The list of files was long: 214 audio recordings, dozens of video files from the hidden cameras, scanned documents, screenshots of text messages, a complete and meticulous archive of my family's self-destruction. My gaze moved over the file names, each one a chapter in the ugly story. Day 0, MP3. The First Hit, Wave. Reconciliation Dinner, Cam 1.mp4. Financial Confession, MP3. My hand moved to the mouse, but I paused. There was one last thing to do. I scrolled to the very bottom of the list, to the last audio file I had added just that morning. I had placed a small digital recorder in my purse before entering the courthouse. The file was labeled Sentencing, MP3. I double-clicked it. The voice of the judge filled my silent apartment. It was the same gravelly, authoritative voice from the courtroom, but here, stripped of the room's heavy atmosphere, it sounded like the voice of history itself, a disembodied, final judgment. Overwhelming evidence of a calculated and cruel series of crimes, a household devoid of the love and trust a family is meant to provide. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that the defendant, Richard Lewis, is sentenced to a term of no less than 7 and no more than 10 years in state prison. It is the further judgment of this court that the defendant, Carol Lewis, is sentenced to a term of no less than 18 months. I listened to the entire pronouncement, to the rustle of papers, to the sharp, final bang of the gavel that followed. Then, silence. The recording ended. The file was closed. I took a deep, slow breath. My hand moved back to the trackpad. I clicked on the first file, Day 0, MP3, then held down the Shift key and clicked on the very last file, Sentencing, MP3. A block of 237 files highlighted in blue. It was my life for the past 6 months, a prison of memory, meticulously constructed. My finger hovered over the delete key. I thought of the sounds contained in those files. My mother's laugh, Rick's shouting, the sound of my own ragged breathing after the assault, the sound of the plate shattering, the sound of their lies, their whispers, their casual cruelty. It was a library of pain, and a library is a place you can visit again and again. I pressed the key. A small box popped up on the screen. Are you sure you want to permanently delete these 236 items? The cursor blinked. There was no hesitation. I clicked delete. There was no dramatic sound effect, no explosion, just a small, silent progress bar that appeared and began to fill, turning green from left to right. It was erasing them. It was erasing the screaming, the crying, the sound of the slap, the hiss of my mother's voice. It was wiping the digital slate clean. In 15 seconds, it was done. The folder was empty. Almost empty. I had deselected one file before I hit delete. I had left a single, solitary recording, Day 0, MP3. The first one, the origin story. I would not keep the record of their punishment, or of my pain. I only needed to keep the record of their sin. It was not a trophy. It was a vaccine, a small, potent dose of the truth to protect me from any future infection of doubt, pity, or misplaced nostalgia. It was a reminder that what happened was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice they had made. I closed the laptop. The blue glow vanished, plunging the room into the soft, gray light of the late afternoon. I stood up, walked to the door, and left my apartment. I went back down to the garage, got back into my car. The silence was complete now. The work was done. I slid the key into the ignition, the main silver key, not the black plastic one, which was now in a box at the bottom of a drawer in my office, its battery dead. The car hummed to life, the dashboard illuminating with a calm, futuristic glow. My hands rested on the steering wheel. They were steady. I turned on the radio, keeping the volume low. It was tuned to the local news station. A calm, professional voice was reading the afternoon headlines, a story about a new town ordinance, a report on traffic, and then, and in local court news, a reminder that justice can sometimes come from the most unexpected of places. Fair Lake residents Richard and Carol Lewis were sentenced today in connection with a high-profile identity theft and fraud case. I turned the radio off. I didn't need to hear the rest. I put the car in reverse, backing out of the space. As I shifted into drive, my eyes flickered up to the rearview mirror. I saw my own face, framed in the small rectangle. I looked at my eyes. For years, they had been the eyes of a survivor, shadowed with a quiet, watchful fear. The fear was gone. The shadows were gone. They were not hard. They were not cold. They were just clear. The eyes of an engineer who had found a critical system failure, isolated the corruption, and rebooted the entire network. A single, quiet thought surfaced, a final line of code executing at the end of a long and complex program. I gave the thought a voice, whispering it to myself in the silent car, a final, fundamental truth. The mic never lies. The car moved forward, out of the dim garage and into the bright, waiting afternoon. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It means the world to have you here. I'd love to know where you're all tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect over our shared thoughts. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And finally, if you want to help this story be heard by more people, please consider hitting that hype button. Your support makes all of this possible.